Hey guys, welcome to another edition of the Monday Morning Tennis Rant. And as the Olympics have come to an end, I can say that the tennis tournament was one of the more exciting events from the Olympics. I had a great time watching other sports as well, such as water polo, a great final between Croatia and Serbia. Serbia came out victorious. I also enjoyed watching the basketball, and I'm a huge fan of track and field. So as I'm scrolling on Twitter yesterday, a very interesting tweet from Andy Murray popped up in which he retweeted an article that stated the following: 28% of Britons believe that if they started training today, they would be able to compete at the 2028 Olympics. And take a look at the list of sports that people think they would have a chance to compete in. And you notice something very interesting. Tennis is not on that list. And I think we can thank Andy Roddick for being very upset about something similar that happened in tennis. I think it was last year or earlier this year, where people thought that they could get games off of professional players, and Andy Roddick got very upset and shared a story that when he was on tour, he beat the intramural tennis champion at Ohio State with a frying pan. So I think people have a better understanding now of the skill and the athleticism that's required to play tennis at the very top level. And I want to thank you guys for all the engagement and my commentary on the final of the Olympics, which I thought was one of the greatest tennis matches that I've ever seen. And after the final, Novak Djokovic was very emotional. It seemed to me, based on his statements, that he might be satisfied with this win and he might actually call it quits. But then a few days later, after I had already made the video, Novak said that he has wishes to play until the 2028 Olympics in the United States. And a lot of you guys in the comments section under my last Monday morning rant couldn't understand why I'm in favor of players retiring when they're at their best. And I want to clarify why I like that. So my favorite player, Rafael Nadal, could have retired after winning the 2022 French Open. That would have been the perfect time for him to retire. Do I enjoy watching Rafael Nadal play now? I absolutely do. I'm having a blast. I love watching him play in Bastad, and I also enjoyed watching Rafa play in doubles at the Olympics with Alcaraz, and I enjoyed watching that match against Djokovic. And I always bring up the example of basketball. I was the biggest Chicago Bulls fan. I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan, and I don't need to tell you guys about Michael Jordan's last shot against the Utah Jazz in the NBA Finals. Now, Michael Jordan came back and played for the Wizards. Did I watch every single Wizards game with Michael Jordan in it? Yes, I did. But I also am of the belief that Michael Jordan probably shouldn't have come back and should have retired, making that game-winning shot against the Utah Jazz. So I think it's just so cool to retire at the top of your game and having the last memory be one where you are a winner of a huge title. So this is why I'm in such awe of Pete Sampras retiring after winning that US Open. To me, there's something super cool about that. But at the same time, I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I am enjoying watching Rafa play, even though he's past his prime. And if Djokovic continues to play for the next 4 years, I'm going to have a lot of fun watching Djokovic play. The tennis tour is better off with Nadal and Djokovic in it. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So I'm excited what's to come in the future. Now, the tennis tour never sleeps, and there were tournaments going on during the Olympics, and Korda did really well by winning Washington. And the week after, there was a Master Series tournament for both the men and the women. In Canada, the men played in Montreal, the women played in Toronto. And Korda again did really well. Took out Zverev in the quarters, which is a big win, and then lost in the semifinals to Papirin, who was also a great player. And surprisingly, Papirin is going to play Rublev in the final. And Rublev has had such an up and down year. He played really well in Madrid, won his second Master Series title after winning Monte Carlo the year prior. And this year, Rublev has had such an up and down year with a lot of drama. There was problems with his behavior on the court, but it's good to see him put it all together. And he actually beat Sinner in this tournament in the quarterfinals. Yes, Sinner had some hip issues, but nevertheless, Rublev is the only player this year to have beaten both Sinner and Alcaraz. So Rublev has unbelievable potential. He's an incredible ball striker, can play well on every surface. The final hasn't started yet, but I think Rublev is going to collect his third Masters Series title, and he's going to beat Popyrin quite comfortably. Now on the women's side, Jessica Pegula, who's a clean ball striker, she does really well on hard courts. She made it to the final and is facing a surprise finalist, Amanda Anisimova, who had to deal with some tough family issues. Her dad passed away, and she was doing really well before that, and then actually took some time off from tennis. But I'll never forget what Nick Kyrgios said about Anisimova. They asked him who the best player was that he ever practiced with from the WTA, because Nick does practice with a lot of female players, and he said that Anisimova was the best ball striker that he's ever seen on the tennis court. So Anisimova has a tremendous amount of potential. She could be in the top 10 of the world, if not higher. She can be a contender to win the biggest titles. And it's hard for me to predict the final between Pegula and Anisimova, and it's going to be very difficult to predict who is going to win the US Open this year on the women's side, because the women's tour has been a lot more up and down than the last 2-3 years. Sabalenka, Swiatek, and Rybakina have not been as consistent as they have been prior to 2024. So it's going to be interesting to see who is going to win this final in Toronto between Pegula and Anisimova, who's going to do well next week in Cincinnati, and who is eventually going to come out on top at the US Open. It's going to be very unpredictable. So during the tournament in Montreal, Nishikori made a surprise run to the quarterfinals, and that was nice to see. Nishikori had to deal with a tremendous amount of injuries, and he's a great player, made that spectacular run to the US Open final. But in the second round, Nishikori beat Tsitsipas, and I talked about the Tsitsipas coaching situation on Instagram. If you don't follow me on Instagram, please do. I do a lot of stories about professional tennis. I talk about some things that I don't cover in my Monday morning rants because I don't want them to be too long. But in any case, I talked about the situation between Tsitsipas and his dad. And I did not like when Tsitsipas criticized his dad's coaching. I thought that was in poor taste. And then a day later, Stefanos apologized to his dad. But he also let everybody know that his dad was not going to be his coach anymore. So I want to use this opportunity to talk about parent coaches in general, but also at the very elite level. And unfortunately, tennis parents, or more specifically, tennis parent coaches, get a lot of flack because of a few bad apples. And I come from Croatia, and this area in general has had a lot of these bad apple tennis parent, tennis coaches. Croatia, Serbia, I'm not going to name any names out of the respect for the players, but there's been a lot of examples of really brutal tennis parent coaches. And unfortunately, the good tennis parents or good tennis parent coaches are all thrown into the same bag as being bad. And over the years, Stefanos has received a lot of criticism for having his dad as his coach, and it's generally perceived to be a mistake to have your dad or your mom as your coach when you're a male player on tour. So here's what I think about the situation. Tennis parents sacrifice a lot for their kid to become a high-level player. It takes a lot of time and effort to drive the kid to practices, to drive the kid to tournaments, to buy the kid tennis equipment. Now, if you happen to be a parent coach, this is a daily battle, and it's often a more difficult battle because the kid might respond to the parent coach differently than they would to a coach that's not a parent. So tennis parent coaches, they put in the hard work and they sacrifice a lot for their kids to maximize their potential, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. Now, of course, a few parents will step over the line and they deserve the opposite of credit. So I'm not going to say that all tennis parent coaches are great, but they're definitely not all bad. And in Tsitsipas's case, I'm sure that his dad sacrificed a lot to bring Steph to the level that he's at right now. Now, the interesting thing is that if we watch the history of tennis, we seldomly see the best players being coached by their parents. And I will say that now we see more tennis parent coaches than we have seen in the past. So the question is, why do you see less parent coaches at the very top of the game. And I do think there's a reason for that. And we have to differentiate between men's tennis and women's tennis. So you see far more parent coaches on the WTA Tour than you see on the ATP Tour. And there's a reason for that. I'm not going to go into the details, in my opinion, why that is the case. And I'm just going to talk about why you don't often see tennis coach parents on the male tour. And I think one big reason is that male players can benefit tremendously for having a parent coach early in development, or maybe even in the beginning stages on tour. But as that player's career develops, I think often players can stall their development if they keep their parent as a coach. And the reason for that could possibly be that some of their individuality and maturity might be hampered if they have a parent with them all the time. See, I do think that being independent and becoming more mature is a great benefit for a male tennis player. And to have your parents constantly by your side can hinder some of the player's independence and maturity in some cases. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this happens to every player, but another thing that a lot of players can identify with is the following. If your parent gives you advice that's tennis related, you might react differently to that advice than receiving that same advice from a coach that's not your parents. You might have a more emotional response to the advice if it's perceived as criticism. So at the emotional level, it's a completely different dynamic. And from my observations as someone who had a parent coach, and me being a tennis parent coach as well for a long time, and also being in the tennis game my whole life, having seen so many tennis parent coaches, I do think that when it comes to the men, at a certain point, they are better off being coached by someone who is not their parent, because they get to develop their independence and they become more mature as tennis players. And of course, I'm not generalizing, because when it comes to tennis, it's an individual sport and we're dealing with different personalities. And I'm sure that there could be some situations where tennis parent coaches, even on the male side, can work quite well. So in the case of Tsitsipas, I see him as someone who's capable of winning Grand Slam tournaments. See, Tsitsipas gets a lot of hate, but he was also one set away from winning the French Open against Novak Djokovic in the final. So this guy is at the upper elite level of the game, capable of winning Grand Slams. I'm a big fan of Tsitsipas, and I do think that this is a step in the right direction. Despite Tsitsipas winning Monte Carlo this year and reaching the final of Barcelona, he's had a relatively poor season. I'm looking forward to the future, and hopefully he's going to be able to maximize his potential, which I think is sky high.